history and progress of Afro-Americans in this country in many ways parallels the development of various music styles over the many years since slavery. In the world of jazz, the roots of many of today's musicians were planted in old New Orleans and expanded northward through traveling bands and the black migration. Professor Ed Smith spoke with us at the University of Buffalo's FM 88 radio station about that historic expansion.
Well, we talk about black music, which consists of the blues and jazz, and the changeover for the blues into jazz was about the 1900s, back in New Orleans with the slaves and the Creoles in New Orleans, and the south part of New Orleans were where they had the Creole music, and the African sound, they could not put in the African sound. The African sound was done like the northern part of New Orleans, where the African sound would come from, and people such as Buddy Bolden, who had a group who started with clarinet, a cornet, who started with many of the reed instruments, were doing that type of music up in New Orleans.
The New Orleans era of the early 1900s also spawned such musical greats as Bunk Johnson and his New Orleans band, the King Oliver Band, and others, and perhaps the most famous musician of all time, trumpeter Louis Satchmo Armstrong.
Louis Armstrong, who worked with Fletcher Henderson, and once he left, Louis Armstrong started his Hot Five, which was a pretty wild sound, which was so much different than what many of the white musicians were doing. Or the Coleman Hawkins, who came with a different style and sound for the tenor saxophone. And then from the Coleman Hawkins came the Lester Young. And the Lester Young, just changed everybody's mind about playing tenor saxophone.
The Lester Young era of the late 20s and 30s was paralleled by the musical growth of a gentleman nicknamed for his royal bearing and regal-sounding music, Edward Duke Ellington.
Right, Duke Ellington started in Washington, D.C. He started with his orchestra in Washington, and he had the fear of going to New York. They said, hey man, you need to go to New York. And Duke didn't feel that he was ready for New York. And when he did hit New York, his sound was called the jungle sound, jungle music they called it, it was different. It was different, but yet it all had that blues. The blues never left the music, we talk about jazz, but yet within really true forms of the so-called word jazz that they do use, that blues is always there,
And the feeling of blues carried jazz through an evolution that included Count Basie's big bands and efforts by Billy Eckstine, a period that saw swing come and go, and a revolutionary approach spawned by Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk, and others that came to be known as bebop.
Right. And we moved on, and then we got into what we call the bebop, where Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, and these people say, hey, these people are crazy, because the music was different. It was just too fast for them. But yet they would take a tune like How High the Moon, a Cherokee, and boom, go through it just like that.
And go through it is what they did as bebop evolved into the modern era with musical artists such as Tad Dameron, Bud Powell, Mary Lou Williams, Horace Silver, Chico Hamilton, Sonny Rollins, Lee Morgan, and Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, all in a creative period beginning in the 50s that produced two legends, Miles Davis and John Coltrane.
Well, I would say that John Coltrane came into being around around in the late 40s and the early 50s. He was a Philadelphia musician, but he came into being around the 50s. But once John Coltrane took off with Miles Davis, you know, a whole new thing about jazz, or a whole new feeling about tenor saxophones came out from John Coltrane. People thought John Coltrane was crazy. The man would play for hours, you know, on a Miles Davis set, and Miles would let him play. And all of a sudden people said, man, what is he playing? Many of the critics was against the kind of music he was playing, you know, and they considered some of it considered revolutionary music. At that time, John Coltrane was going through his personal lifestyle, trying to get himself together. But then as we followed John Coltrane, once he did get himself together and knew where he was going with his music and searching, and this, I mean, I think, you know, with you, Ron, you know, you can go from the beginning of John Coltrane to the end and watch the evolution of a musician that went from what they called a revolutionary concept to a spiritual concept.
The legacy left by the late John Coltrane is one that may never be fully measured because of its broad impact and the fact that almost every young musician today is patterning himself off one phase or another of the Coltrane legacy.
There'll always be someone will pick up where Betty Carter left off, or wherever John Coltrane's left off. Someone will come along and pick up. There are young people, thank God that there are young people that are listening to some of those old musicians. And they have to listen to the old musicians to pick up where do we go from here.
Of course, there's no way to name all the many musicians who contributed to the variety of styles we're able to enjoy today. But we salute all those past and future musicians who keep the music going.